This contains content from one of our Patterns of Evidence Collector's Edition box sets. Our Collector's Edition material allows you to dig deeper into additional interviews and evidences not able to be included in the body of our main films that further affirm the historical credibility of the Bible in powerful ways. If you're interested in getting your own copies of this material, please visit our online store via our website, patternsofevidence.com.
So God tells Moses, go down the mountain and see what is going on down there.
In 2003, I filmed people from around the world telling the Bible's account of the people of Israel being miraculously brought out of Egypt in the Exodus. One of them was Vishal Mengawati, a Christian philosopher from India.
So Moses begins by making a request, but as Pharaoh hardens his heart, it leads to a confrontation. First confrontation is over the river Nile. Pharaoh goes there as usual early in the morning. Moses goes to say that, look, I'm speaking on behalf of God. God asked you to send his people go so that they might worship him, but you've hardened your heart. I'm going to put this staff in my hand over these waters, and these waters will turn into blood. The fish in Nile will die. What is the source of life for you will in fact become source of death, bringing tremendous hardship on your people because you have been inflicting this hardship on God's people. And that begins the confrontation. Many other plagues follow: the flies, the locusts, the hail, the boil, animals dying, crops being destroyed. This people, the slaves who were supposed to be economic asset, now turn into an economic liability. The whole nation is perishing because Pharaoh will not let the slaves go.
If we look at the plagues of Egypt, some have suggested that the contest between Moses and Pharaoh is a contest between Moses, God, and the gods of Egypt. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, there's something to be said for the idea that there is this cosmic battle going on. In Exodus chapter 5, the God of Israel says, let my people go. Pharaoh says, who is the Lord? Who is Jehovah? Who is Yahweh that I should listen to him? And so we have setting up there this contest. Who really is the God to be obeyed? Who is the one in control of things? So I think what you have going on is that you have Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt versus the God of Israel. I don't think, as some have tried, to connect particular Egyptian deities to particular plagues. That just does not work. There's no fly god in Egypt. And the other thing too is that even animals like the frogs that might be associated with the goddess Hecate, or cows that might be associated with the goddess Hathor, the Egyptians were not Hindus. They didn't believe that every god was every animal, or every animal was a god. So they didn't view things that way. They ate meat. They ate birds. They ate ducks. So they didn't see the gods equal animals and so on. But I think what we're dealing with there is Pharaoh is the god of the state of Egypt and responsible for cosmic order, and the gods and he work together on this. So that's the challenge that we see going on. Who is the one responsible for all this? And of course, Pharaoh comes off looking very weak, impotent, and even the magicians say, look, this is the finger of God. This is not just some magic going on. This is the real deal.
These plagues were not merely punishment and retribution. Each plague brought a certain refinement, a certain elevation to the thinking and to the personality of the Egyptians. Because the story says, Egypt will know, God says, Egypt will know me before this is over. So it really was the refinement and the elevation of Egypt. And by the end of the 10th plague, Pharaoh was actually convinced, God is right, I was wrong.
Do you think that the Exodus events are miraculous, or are they natural events of a progression of circumstances that happen?
The way I look at the plagues and the Exodus, In the case of most people of the ancient world, the Hebrews as well as the Egyptians, they drew no distinction between natural and supernatural. And I think it's in our modern scientific worldview that we've created this dichotomy between natural and supernatural. In the Bible, God, or for the Egyptians, gods, control everything. And so there is no such distinction. And so I prefer to try to come at it as much as I can through their worldview, not ours. From their perspective, everything happens according to the hand of God. So that the magicians could say to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. No matter what it was, locusts, these things occur naturally. But they would understand that the fact that these locusts came, or these other insects that were swarming Egypt and flies, happened the way it did, when it did, the intensity with which it came, would be something that they couldn't just write off to say, well, this is natural, this happens. Well, they would understood everything as being supernatural. And so I try to look at the Bible the way they did.
What you are doing when you are seeing these Exodus plagues, if you like, they are physical things, real things. There's no problem about there may be miracles, but they are physical things. The Nile can turn red. There are various ways why the Nile can turn red. Today we say Mother Nature did this, Mother Nature did that. An ancient Israelite would say God did this, God did that, and there's no problem with that. God works through nature. It's not a theological issue, this. God doesn't have to work miracles that are not natural miracles. Okay, and it's very interesting to know that the word nature is an ancient Egyptian word. The word nature in Egyptian comes from necher, which is the word for gods, necheru. So in fact, nature itself, the word nature, derives from the original word for Egyptian god. There's been lots of scientific theories and explanations about what these plagues are, and I actually wouldn't have a problem with the idea it's to do with algae that turns the river into blood or red, and that as a consequence of that certain things happen, like frogs come out of the water because it's poisoned, or fish are dead, and these things can cause plagues amongst cattle and stuff. I don't see a problem with the sequence explaining this.
So the idea of the miracles of the Exodus, because that's a lot of people have a hard time with all those miracles because of science saying that these two ideas aren't friendly to each other. Just the plagues, for example. How would you explain the plagues in the story of the Exodus?
Right, so if you look at the plagues through the eyes of a scientist, what is remarkable is that with many of them, one plague seems to lead to another, right? And so it's like an ecological disaster taking place before your eyes. And I think that's the case. So I'll just describe a few plagues. So the first plague was that the River Nile turned to blood. So the first question you ask, if you're a scientist and not a Christian, is, does this mean real blood or not real blood? Well, the Bible actually gives you the answer, amazingly, because it says the Egyptians dug by the side of the Nile and they could drink water. So this means that the blood-red water in the Nile, when it was filtered through the sand, became pure water. So the sand was doing a filtration process. Now we know that blood, the red platelets in blood are so small, they would not be filtered out by sand, so they wouldn't get through. So it had to be something bigger, that's something causing the redness, which is bigger than the blood. So that's, the Bible's actually telling you, it's not real blood, it's a colour of blood, right, which is actually fine. And then you say, well, why does water turn red? It's well known all over the world that if you have certain algae, then they can do what's called bloom. And they may not be red to start with, but they turn red when they bloom. And some of those algae are poisonous. When they bloom, they're poisonous. And they kill the fish. And that's recorded in America. Lots of fish have died with algae blooms in rivers in America. You can look it up on the web. And so a scientific explanation is that for the first plague is that there were algae in the Nile, they bloomed, they emitted toxins, and all the fish died. So that's the first plague. And then the second plague, I think, is the plague of frogs. And so basically you have these frogs which normally would be around the Nile, and it is stinking and decayed fish, and so the frogs, you know, hop inland and they go into people's houses, so you get this plague of frogs. And then when they're in the houses, they don't have much food, and so they die, So the frogs and the fish are all stinking and decaying, and so you get a plague of gnats, and then you get a plague of flies, and both those are due to these decaying fish, you know. And so these plagues all follow one another, and then the gnats are probably midges, which a particular sort of midge, which we know exists in Egypt. The flies were real plagues, so probably not house flies, something worse than that. There's something called stable flies, which actually pierce your skin of humans and animals. Camels and cattle and sheep, they were killed at the next plague, and that was due to the gnats spreading a particular disease, which these gnats called, I think, coidicoides is their Latin name. They spread this disease which kills just hoof mammals, which are the ones which are mentioned. And then the boils were caused by the stable flies, which give these painful bites which get infected. So, you know, one plague leads to another. And I would say that that story fits so, I mean, I could go on, you know, with the other plagues. It fits so well that I would say that must be the explanation. It fits so well, and the observation is very acute. It's, you know, if you interchange two of these plagues, get them in the wrong order, then you can't have this scientific sequence. So they've been recorded in the right order. But I would say the miracle is then in the timing, that God has used these natural events to occur at the right time. So every time Moses goes to Pharaoh and Pharaoh sends him away, another plague comes. And it's remarkable timing. But God doesn't have to break any of the laws he's established. He's just using the nature and, you know, getting it all to work at the right time. So I say they're definitely miracles.
There's so many phenomena in these plagues that if they're analysed, they seem to show the conditions of the Nile Valley at a time when the river, which used to flood annually, still does, came down with far more water than usual. And Greta Hort showed many years ago, if you examined the microbiology and all these special things, it would be consonant with red earth and other things coming down the Nile, choking and killing the fish. Then you get infections that come up with the frogs, and of course one plague led to another, which brought illness on man and beast. Then you get, after that, a sequence of other things which came from not land and river, but from the sky. You got the hail, you got the locusts, and you got the dark cloud, an extra heavy version of what you find called the Khamsin, the dark clouds of dust in Egypt. And the whole thing is in a sequence from about July, August, when the Nile rises, right through to the following March, when the agricultural Nile cycle is over and the crops are coming up. It follows one unified cycle. You can't split the narrative up and make it into bits, and it's 9 plagues that follow the sequence. It's a purely Nilotic phenomenon from Sudan through into Egypt to the Mediterranean. It couldn't be invented by somebody in a different part of the world. That's quite clear. Are there Egyptian mentions of this sort of thing? The redness of the Nile, the famous papyrus, Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage, speaks about 1700 or 1800 BC, its date, but it probably relates to earlier times, about a pharaoh who wasn't doing things very well. He's been criticized by the sage, and he says, look, everyone's poor, everything's being destroyed, the Nile is red, we cannot drink the water. And that shows a condition similar to what you're getting in the biblical account. So it indicates it was a Nilotic phenomenon.
Where we do get a major change, though, is the last few plagues. When we get to the plague of darkness, for instance, and the death of the firstborn. Now, these are not normal. You can't see a sequence deriving from the first set of plagues. They seem to be a separate set of plagues, and these are quite spectacular. So what the last few plagues were is an entirely different matter. As a historian, I can't explain any of those last plagues.
I do think that everything the Bible does say about this event can be understood in perhaps different terms, more modern terms, the way we would say it. And if you let the computers do the math, in the year 1446, the whole nation was to be celebrating all about the Pharaoh. I mean, it was all about him in the very week of Passover. In fact, it was probably the day that they were to set aside the lambs that the great festival began throughout the nation.
So you're saying that there's 2 things going on here. One of them is the nation of Egypt is celebrating the year of Thutmose, the year that he comes to reign.
It's celebrating the anniversary of
The anniversary of that,
year.
yes. But the Israelites are going to be celebrating something completely different.
It's interesting that it's like they're being They're being guided into certain days here. This month will be for you the first of months. You count 10 days, then you set aside your lamb. On the 14th day at evening, then you slaughter that lamb. You kill the lamb. You wonder why this is supposed to be happening at just this certain time. Well, the great king is expecting everybody in the nation to be celebrating him. It's all about him. So when Moses comes with this on the horizon and says, "Thus says the Lord, let my people go," what's he going to do? He's already full of himself. Pharaohs are supposed to be full of themselves. He's not going to diminish or blemish his great celebration by letting a bunch of slaves go, even if he ever would. A festival like that would go on for a few days. This is also the time of first fruits, the first fruits of the fields. No ordinary person would dare partake of those first fruits until the priests had theirs and the king had his, and it was all right. The signal had gone forth that you might now partake of the first fruits of the barley harvest. This barley harvest had been hammered by the plague of the hail. Colin Humphreys has set this out, and a couple of epidemiologists before him. The conditions in the fields with the storage of that barley harvest, what little was left of it, was perfect for the development of mycotoxins, poison. Nobody is eating of this until the signal is given, you may now participate in the first fruits. Israel has been commanded to put away all leaven. Any moist grain is leaven. They're not supposed to have it among them. Now, at the end of his great festival, Pharaoh does something that pharaohs have routinely done. He reverts part of their offering that they have brought. He lets them take some of it home. And I should think that...
And how do you know that? Is that's common practice?
That's a standard thing that pharaohs did, and you could find evidence of that in the books.
I think I see where you're going here. That they basically let them take something that was toxic.
They didn't know it was toxic. No one had eaten it yet. And Israel was forbidden to have any of that kind of substance among them. They didn't know it was toxic. No one knew it was toxic. But now, as the big festival comes to an end and the people go to their homes, the last part of this ceremony is that maybe the firstborn gets a double portion. And I think that that's the mechanism of the miracle for what happened to the firstborn of the Egyptians and why Israel was spared. And that works with Thutmose III, because this was the week of his great celebration.
Right at that same time.
Right at that same time.
I think there's something you can ask about a miracle.
Although Herschel Schenk's definition of what a miracle is can be questioned, his straightforward interpretation of what the Bible describes fits more with the Hebrew approach.
Take the plagues. One of them is that the Nile ran blood. Now, the ancient Israelites may have understood this to be a miracle. They did. And people look for rational physical explanations of this. And they say, well, if you have this certain algae that goes in at this time of the year, then the Nile flows red and it looks like blood. Now that seems a little far-fetched to me, even if there is this algae, because the Bible doesn't say it flowed with red algae, it says it flowed with blood. But even if you say, well, this is how the ancient Israelite historian imagined it, then I think that doesn't deepen the story one whit for me. As a matter of fact, it makes it less attractive because it shows a miracle to be a magic trick. That's not what a miracle is. And to people who need that to confirm faith, then I have to say, if you need this to confirm your faith, you have a mighty weak faith. And I'd rather go with what the Bible says.
The objective of the plagues was so that Egypt will know God. So it wasn't just punishment for his stubbornness or for his wickedness. It was in order to change him from the belief in the many gods to the belief in God himself, to the exclusion of the other gods. And that's why there were 10 plagues. The 10th plague could have happened right from the start, and the Jews would have left Egypt, but it wouldn't have changed Egypt. When we tell the story to children, and we kind of enjoy the suffering of the Egyptians, you know, there was blood, and then there were frogs, and then, that's not the point of the plague, just to torture the Egyptians. It was to break them down so that they would change their thinking. The first plague was the Nile turning into blood, because the first thing you got to do is attack their main belief, their fundamental belief, which was the belief in the Nile. After that, it was intimidation, it was wearing them down, it was convincing them that these are really coming from God, not from some magician, not from some sorcerer. And that's why there's the emphasis on the fact that the plague did not affect the Jews, which is kind of strange. It's hard to imagine. There's darkness. For 3 days, nobody can move. It's completely dark, but not for the Jews. It's not like there was a border. You know, it's dark on this side of the street, but not on that side of the street, because then the Egyptians could always cross the street. It was dark wherever the Egyptians went, and it was light wherever a Jew went. This is a real miracle. And the idea of the plagues and the miracles, and eventually the crossing of the sea, the whole point of it is that it convinced the Egyptians and Pharaoh that this is God's idea, that this is God coming to take his people. Now, if they weren't real miracles, it wouldn't have worked. If it was just a series of events that happened to work out correctly, it wouldn't have changed Pharaoh's mind and would not have brought him a new belief. So they had to be genuine miracles.
All those plagues could have natural explanation of locusts and hail and boils, etc. What was miraculous was that the victims, the slaves, they were not suffering from these plagues. They were being protected. Divine hand was upon them. But the oppressors who have been exploiting the slaves, they were suffering these plagues. And there was a very clear a division that God was on the side of the victims who had been crying out to God, but he was against the arrogant who wanted to keep this injustice of slavery going.
With this, Pharaoh's heart hardens and hardens and hardens even more. God forewarned Moses what he was about to do, that the 10th and final plague would be the most severe on the land of Egypt, the most severe that Pharaoh would ever see. And so he would smite the firstborn of every household in the land. But the Hebrews were to be spared, because as the angel of death passed over the land, they were to kill a lamb and place the blood on the doorpost. In this way, the angel of death would spare the firstborn in that household. And that became a very symbolic ceremony for the Hebrews, known today as the Passover. The final plague would break the Pharaoh. It became very personal. The firstborn of every Egyptian home would die. This meant Pharaoh's son too would die. And in this way, it touched Pharaoh in a way unlike the others. This 10th and final plague would move Pharaoh to allow Moses and Aaron to lead the Hebrews out of the land of Egypt, out of their slavery and suffering, to worship God on the mountain.
None of the slaves lost their male children. That was a divine distinction made between the oppressors and the oppressed. It was very significant that it would have been seen as a divine retribution They had been killing the male children of the Hebrews. Now their own male children had died in one night. They were frightened that God is in fact against our sin and our evil and against us. So Pharaoh calls Moses in the middle of the night and he says, please, before worse calamity comes, maybe even we would be killed. So you take your people and go. And that is when Exodus really begins.
The Bible makes it very clear, in fact emphasizes, that Israel was not taken out of Egypt by natural causes or by emancipation or escape, but that it was the hand of God who came to take his people to Mount Sinai.
It is very, very hard to find a scientific explanation to the plagues, at least how they are described in the biblical text. How things came one day and disappeared the other day, how diseases affected animals and Egyptians, but not Hebrews, etc.
It would have been easy to interpret this death as coincidence or some epidemic or some disease, but it became impossible to give a natural explanation for this death because Moses had actually predicted that on such and such day this will happen, and he had given the remedy. And as the angel of death passes during the night, he will spare the families from this great calamity where this blood is on the doorpost. So those Hebrew families which followed the instructions saved their lives, and thereby they also knew that this was no coincidence, but this was really God punishing the oppressors and delivering and saving the oppressed who had been crying unto God. There was a very clear demonstration that what Moses had predicted as the prophet of God had actually happened.
Okay, Leonard, there's a theory that a volcano caused the plagues. For example, smoke from a volcano called the plague of darkness. What do you think about that?
I don't believe in it at all, because that cloud would have passed over the Hebrews before it reached the Egyptians. But according to the biblical text, the Hebrews were not affected.
So the smoke would have had to come from the volcano, across the Mediterranean,
Yes.
over the Hebrews first.
Yes.
And so that particular idea, it would be contrary to a natural cause.
Yes, it's a very strange thing. There is a strong belief in that it was a strong earthquake, a kind of explosion of an island in Greece, the Santorini island, and it was a huge explosion taking place there. And there are people that have a strong belief that this is scientific evidence that they follow the pillar of smoke and the pillar of fire because they saw this from this volcano or this eruption. And of course this is a completely impossible thing. Not to mention that it's wrong according to everything in terms of direction and so on. But that would imply that it would cross the Mediterranean Sea, to just mention one thing. The other thing is, it's not possible to see anything that takes place in Greece if you are in Egypt. But there's a lot of people that believe in this because it's a scientific reason and a scientific solution to something that they think of. And when I sometimes say that there is no scientific explanation to it, that doesn't bother me. Some scientists get scared to death when you say that. But it doesn't bother me, because there is a lot of things where we don't have any scientific explanation to. It has to do with things in our bodies, it has to do with the universe as a whole. There is a lot of questions where we don't have any scientific explanation to. And sometimes we just have to live with that.